In mid-March 2026, footage released by a Ukrainian drone unit claims to show a $500 FPV, first-person view, drone finding a Russian jamming station reportedly worth $10 million. The station sat 30 kilometers, about 19 miles, behind the front line near Balochky, occupied Zaporizhzhia. The footage shows one hit on its antenna mast, disabling it. The unit credited, the 413th Raid Regiment of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, filmed the approach. The target was an R-330Zh Zhitel, a machine Russia builds to blind and mute Ukrainian drones before they reach anything worth hitting. On this account, it failed against the one drone that mattered. The failure traces to a weakness built into almost every electronic warfare post Russia has fielded in this war. What is that weakness, and why does it keep repeating? Electronic warfare, EU for short, uses radio energy instead of explosives to disable an enemy weapon. In this war, that mostly means jamming. A jammer floods the frequencies a drone needs, either to hear its GPS satellites or to hear its own pilot, with noise loud enough that the drone loses its way or drops out of the sky. Russia has built an entire family of purpose-made vehicles to do this at scale. The R-330Zh Zhitel struck at Balochky is a truck-mounted system, riding on a Ural or Kamaz chassis according to published technical descriptions. It automates the jamming of GPS, GLONASS, Russia's own satellite navigation network, and the radio links FPVs use to talk to their pilots. Think of it as a radio station built for exactly one purpose: deafening the enemy's drones over a stretch of sky several dozen kilometers wide around the clock. It runs whether or not any drone happens to be flying through it at that moment. Around-the-clock coverage of that much sky is why Russia builds these systems in the first place. A single Zhitel, correctly positioned, can degrade Ukrainian drone operations across a whole sector of front line. Everything behind it, the artillery, the supply routes, the command posts, the troop concentrations, sits under a jamming bubble that costs nothing to keep running once it is switched on. It never reloads or resupplies, and it never rotates out the way a human air defense crew eventually does. Set against that is the weapon credited with killing one. An FPV drone is the cheapest tool in this war. A racing drone airframe carrying a small warhead, flown by a pilot watching a video feed through goggles. Building one takes an afternoon and a few $100s. Defense Express and other Ukrainian defense industry outlets put the cost of a Zhitel at roughly $10 million. A machine that can suppress an entire sector's drone effort reportedly went dark because something priced like a mid-range laptop found it first. The gap between those two numbers is what this episode explains. Neither side expected drones to matter this much when this war began, and that is why electronic warfare became such a priority for Russia. Cheap first-person drones turned into the tool that finds artillery, corrects glide bombs, and kills armor at a rate no pre-war planning accounted for. Jamming was the fastest available answer, cheaper than shooting every drone down one at a time, and reusable against wave after wave instead of a single expendable interceptor. Defense press analysts describe the bubble a working Zhitel throws as reaching out roughly 25 to 50 kilometers, depending on terrain and the target drone's own frequency hopping. Russia parks these systems deep enough behind the line to sit inside their own coverage. Analysts covering the Balochky strike frame the loss as opening a gap in that coverage for Ukrainian drones passing through afterward. Treat that as framing of a plausible local effect. No measured study of accuracy or drone survival rates in that stretch of front was found. One more piece of context matters before the mechanism itself. The unit credited with the Balochky strike was no improvised drone team bolted onto an infantry brigade. Ukraine stood up its unmanned systems forces as a dedicated military branch in 2024. Reportedly the first time any country in this war organized drone warfare as a full service rather than a support function. Inside it sit raid regiments built specifically to hunt targets like this one. The side finding these jamming trucks runs a standing institution built for exactly this hunt. Zhitel is not new. Variants have been in Russian service for over a decade. The original design targeted Western GPS-guided precision weapons and satellite communications. Cheap first-person drones barely existed as a battlefield category when that design was frozen. An older system built for one threat now faces a different one. The mismatch is the thread the rest of this episode pulls on. What is it about the way Russia has to use these systems that keeps letting a $500 drone find a $10 million one? The answer starts with a piece of physics that cannot be engineered away. To jam something, a system has to transmit. Electronic warfare is not passive listening. It is active broadcasting. A transmitter loud enough to blind a drone's GPS receiver or drown out its control link for kilometers in every direction is, by the same physics, loud enough for the other side to hear and locate. The strength of its own signal is what makes a Zhitel or a Krasuka effective, and that same strength gives away exactly where it is standing. Direction finding, triangulating a radio source from 2 or more listening points, is not exotic technology. Both sides use it constantly against each other's drone pilots. Point the same technique at a fixed jamming truck, and it behaves exactly as it does against a handheld radio. Think of it as a lighthouse in reverse. A lighthouse is built to be seen from far away. Its whole purpose depends on throwing light in every direction so ships can find it. A jamming station wants the opposite. It wants to be invisible. Physics forces it to behave like a lighthouse anyway: continuous broadcast, high power, a fixed set of frequencies. From a position it usually cannot move quickly. It cannot dim itself and still do its job. The second half of the weakness is immobility. Analysts covering the Balochky strike noted that the Zhitel's central limitation is that it has to sit still to work. These are not small systems. A Zhitel rides a heavy truck chassis with a deployable antenna mast that has to be raised and aimed. A Krasuka 4, one step up in Russia's U hierarchy, travels as a small convoy, an emitter carrying its distinctive parabolic dish, paired with separate support and power generation trucks. The Krasuka is built to jam radar and satellite links at a claimed range of over 150 kilometers, and that draws more power than one engine comfortably provides. Lear-3 works differently again, a ground station that launches Orlan-10 drones as flying relays to intercept and jam cell networks and geolocate the phones connected to them. Those relay drones solve one problem and create another. An Orlan-10 aloft on a fixed patrol pattern is its own radio-emitting target, so a Lear-3 team has 2 things to hide instead of 1. All 3 systems share the same requirement: park, extend the antenna, start transmitting, and stay there for as long as the jamming bubble needs to hold. A slow, methodical reconnaissance effort needs exactly that window to place a strike, and a jamming truck doing its job hands the window over every time. Not every Russian U system fits the truck picture, and the exception fails for the same underlying reason in a different shape. Pole 21 is a jamming payload mounted on or near existing civilian cell towers, borrowing infrastructure that is already standing to blanket an area with GPS and GLONASS interference. A cell tower cannot relocate once its jammer is discovered, and nobody swaps a cell tower out for a spare overnight. Pole 21 inherits the Zhitel's immobility problem in a harder form. The targeting calculation is what changes. The jammer shares its footprint with civilian communications infrastructure, which complicates any decision about whether and how to strike it. A Zhitel is findable because it has to sit still in a field. Pole 21 is findable for the identical reason, minus the field. One more wrinkle cuts both ways on the jamming side of this fight. Some Ukrainian drones now use frequency-hopping radios, switching control channels many times a second on a pattern only the drone and its ground controller know in advance. To have any effect against them, a jammer has to blanket a wide band instead of one fixed frequency. So a Zhitel's bubble ends up loud and broad, and loud and broad is exactly the signature direction finding is best at catching. The same engineering choice that makes a drone harder to jam makes the jammer trying to stop it easier to find. The front line itself works against Russia's doctrine here. These systems were designed for a war where the front barely moved, and Russian forces could count on operating from the same well-mapped rear areas for months at a time. Ukraine's shifting, drone-saturated front broke that assumption years ago. A Zhitel or a Krasuka now sits inside the same contested airspace its own jamming is supposed to protect, watched by reconnaissance drones that need persistence rather than luck. Once one of those drones confirms a fixed antenna mast in the same spot for long enough, distance from the front stops hiding the target. 30 kilometers used to feel safe. Against a drone with real range and a steady spotter, 30 kilometers is a short flight. One irony sharpens the whole picture. The best documented EU kill in this pattern is the Krasuka 4 destroyed near Urozhaine in 2023. A drone found it. 2 GPS guided glide bombs killed it. A satellite-guided weapon ended a system built specifically to jam radar and satellite links. The Krasuka's own jamming envelope, tuned to protect against exactly that kind of guidance, evidently was not enough to stop the aircraft that dropped those bombs once its position was known. It is the clearest illustration available of the mechanism this section teaches. Once an EU post is found, by drone or by any other means, the same immobility that gave it away also leaves it with no good answer. The coming years point the same direction, and worse for Russia's doctrine. A growing share of the drones flown against these systems now run on fiber-optic control lines instead of radio. A thin spool of optical cable trails the drone in flight, carrying the pilot's commands and video feed over glass instead of over the air. It is the difference between shouting an order across a field, where anyone with a receiver can hear it, and passing a written note hand-to-hand down a line, where there is nothing broadcast for an eavesdropper to catch. A radio-controlled FPV can, in principle, be jammed by exactly the system it is attacking. A fiber-optic drone cannot, because there is no radio signal to find in the first place. Ukraine's own 414th Unmanned Systems Brigade has claimed operational fiber-optic ranges up to roughly 41 kilometers, per Ukrainian defense press reporting on the program. CISA's own analysis of the fiber-optic shift separately describes figures in the same general band. 41 kilometers is enough cable, with little to spare, to reach a Zhitel parked 30 kilometers back. The technology is young. A spool of cable is dead weight, and dragging it costs the drone speed, so a fiber-optic FPV today buys its silence with performance. It will only get lighter and longer ranged from here. The weapon best suited to killing an electronic warfare post is, increasingly, a weapon that post cannot detect by definition. None of this means a fiber-optic drone is unstoppable once it is already inbound. Analysts and NATO's own Allied command transformation have pointed to netting, barbed wire, and small arms as countermeasures that still work against a fiber-optic FPV, precisely because there is no signal left to jam. For a fixed EU post, the problem is timing. Stringing net over open ground and clearing fields of fire takes planning, labor, and material. A jamming truck parked to cover a radio spectrum rather than to defend its own perimeter rarely has any of that in place before a patient reconnaissance drone finds it. Picture the shape of a strike like this one. What follows is the pattern these units' own footage shows again and again, not a record of Balochky specifically. A reconnaissance feed holds on a fixed antenna mast. The strike drone drops to the deck, clears the tree line, and covers the final stretch fast. The Zhitel is built to listen across a set of radio bands, not to watch the ground around it, so a silent, wire-guided approach gives it nothing to detect and nothing to jam. The gap between what the system is built to sense and what is actually coming at it is the entire mechanism, in one image. $500 against 10 million. The exchange is not a one-off. It repeats, with varying degrees of confirmation, across multiple claimed strikes on Russian electronic warfare positions from 2023 through 2026. Being clear about exactly how confirmed each one is matters more here than almost anywhere else in this niche. Every incident below is a Ukrainian military claim, evidenced by footage a unit released itself, not something confirmed by Oryx or independently geolocated by a named analyst. Two exceptions to that pattern are noted where they occur. If breakdowns like this are why you're here, subscribing costs nothing and keeps the next one coming. In the second half of April 2026, Ukraine's National Guard released footage claiming a strike on another R-330Zh Zhitel, this time in the Kharkiv region. The unit behind it calls itself Lasar's Group. The same footage claims a nearby command and staff vehicle alongside it. The method matches Balochky closely. A fixed-wing reconnaissance drone confirmed the target and its coordinates, then a separate strike element finished the job. A command and staff vehicle is the post's coordination point, where an U unit's own commanders track which frequencies are jammed where and pass targeting cues back to units it is protecting. Losing that vehicle alongside the jammer does more damage than losing the jammer alone. The local defense loses its noise and the coordination that decided where to aim it. Two vehicles claimed destroyed in the same window is a bigger claim than Balochky's single antenna hit, and it carries correspondingly less independent scrutiny. Further back, in February of 2025, during Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region, a Ukrainian Special Operations Unit known as UA Reg Team claimed an FPV strike on yet another Zhitel near Belitsa. Servicing personnel were reportedly killed, a casualty claim with no independent confirmation. That incursion put Ukrainian troops on ground inside Russia itself for months, and that matters here. This claimed kill, if accurate, happened on what was nominally the defender's own home territory, not in occupied Ukraine, where at least the attacker has a plausible home field advantage in local knowledge. A separate, distinct claim credits a Zhitel kill in Donetsk region to a state border guard service unit, Phoenix Company. The system was reportedly destroyed while the unit was repelling a Russian assault nearby. Different unit, different branch, different front. One more entry in the same pattern, rather than a repeat of the Kursk claim. The Krasuka 4 case already covered in the mechanism section belongs here too, as the one confirmed adjacent data point in the set. Ukrainian sources describe it as only the second loss of that system in the war, struck in forest terrain between the occupied settlements of Urozhine and Lankove in Zaporizhzhia in November of 2023. Reported cost of the system roughly $2.6 million, again an estimate with no traceable manufacturer or budget source behind it. Unlike the drone strikes above, this one involved a crewed strike aircraft. It sits closer to independently observable than the FPV-only claims, though still short of a named Oryx line item in the sourcing found for this video. One further pattern surfaces repeatedly across Ukrainian and Russian defense press coverage, without clearing the bar for detail here. Several outlets reference additional FPV strikes on Pole 21-cell tower jammers credited to Ukrainian intelligence. Dates and locations are inconsistent enough across sources that no single distinct incident could be pinned down with confidence. The gap is part of the story. A channel that only showed the clean cases would misrepresent how uncertain most of this record actually is. Look at who is doing the hunting across these cases, and a second pattern shows up. Balochky was Ukraine's dedicated unmanned systems forces. Kharkiv was a National Guard unit. Kursk was a special operations team. And the separate Donetsk claim was a border guard service company. The Crimea claim below comes from a government intelligence directorate rather than a combat unit. 5 different kinds of organization, across 5 different chains of command, all converging on the same target class. The spread argues against this being one specialist team's trick. It reads more like a hunting method that has diffused across Ukraine's entire military structure, and that is a harder thing for any single Russian countermeasure to defend against than one elite unit's playbook would be. The most recent claim in this pattern, and the largest in scale, did not come from a frontline unit at all. On the night of July 26th into 27th, 2026, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate, the HER released footage it says shows a strike on a Murmansk-BN system near Cape Philent in occupied Crimea. Murmansk-BN is a different class of system from the Zhitel. It is a long-range, high-frequency signals intercept array mounted across a convoy of masts, shelters, and generator trucks rather than a single vehicle. High-frequency radio waves bounce off the upper atmosphere instead of traveling in a straight line. That is what lets a station like this listen and jam over distances reportedly measured in thousands of kilometers against the tens of kilometers of frontline Zhitel covers. The scale differs, but the weakness underneath is the same. A signal strong enough to bounce off the atmosphere and back down again is, if anything, an easier one to trace to its source. This is deep rear area territory, well behind the front line the rest of this pattern is built around. The claim comes entirely from the HER, an official Ukrainian government source with an obvious interest in the story it tells. The HER frames it as one of roughly 200 Russian air defense and electronic warfare assets it says Ukraine hit in the first half of 2026 alone, an aggregate figure with no independent verification found, treated as the far edge of the same pattern rather than a confirmed fact to build anything else on. The underlying vulnerability scales from a frontline truck to a strategic asset on occupied territory. None of the dollar figures across these cases come with a published manufacturer invoice or defense ministry budget line. They are estimates repeated across Ukrainian defense industry outlets, directional rather than audited. Even so, two comparisons describe the same lopsided trade from different angles. A $500 drone against a reported $10 million Zhitel, and a far cheaper reconnaissance drone spotting a $2.6 million Krasuka for a pair of guided bombs. General drone war cost commentary elsewhere puts a typical FPV strike on an armored vehicle at somewhere between $2,000 and $6,000 of enemy equipment destroyed for every dollar spent on the attacking drone. It is another directional figure rather than an audited one. If the reported Zhitel price holds up, the Balochky exchange runs several times steeper than that armored vehicle baseline. It is one more reason a lone jamming truck sitting in a field is a more attractive target than it might first appear. If you are the officer deciding where to park the next Zhitel, every one of these stories says the same thing a different way. The front line has gotten cheap eyes, and cheap eyes are enough to end an expensive machine's war. Pull these incidents and the mechanism behind them together, and the lesson reaches past any single truck or village. It is a lesson about what happens to a defensive doctrine built around staying still. Russia's electronic warfare posts were designed for a war of fixed fronts and predictable rear areas. They are now fighting a war where a $500 drone with a patient pilot can turn 30 kilometers of supposed safety into no distance at all. Not a wall that keeps drones out, but a lighthouse that tells them exactly where to look. Three things are worth watching from here, and none of them require a single new weapon to be invented. The fiber-optic shift matters most. As more strike drones move off radio control entirely, the one countermeasure that sometimes works against a radio FPV, jamming the pilot's signal, stops applying to the aircraft doing the hunting. A jamming truck built around that countermeasure has nothing left in its toolkit against the drones that matter. The location math also keeps getting worse for fixed U-posts as reconnaissance drones get cheaper and more numerous on both sides. The kind of spotting that found the Zhitel at Balochky becomes routine rather than exceptional. The third thing to watch is whether Russia starts dispersing its EU capability into smaller, more mobile, less powerful units, trading jamming range for survivability. The trade is the only doctrinal answer this mechanism points toward, and it carries a real cost. A dozen weaker jammers covering a dozen small patches of sky protect less ground per system than one Zhitel did, even if each one is harder to find. None of this, taken together, makes Russian electronic warfare obsolete. A degraded jamming bubble is still a jamming bubble. Most Zhitels and Krasukas fielded across this front are still standing and still working, and the systems that survive are still doing real damage to Ukrainian drone operations every day this war continues. It used to take an expensive aircraft and real risk to find out where a jamming bubble's edge was. Now it can take a drone that costs less than a used bicycle, flown by someone patient enough to watch one antenna mast for as long as it takes. What has not changed is the target's own signal, switching on every time it goes to work. For the same reason, none of the figures in this video will settle into a final tally anytime soon. No independent institution has published a confirmed count of how many of these systems have actually been lost this way. And until one does, every fresh claim joins the same pattern rather than closing it. The same cheap drone logic follows next out to sea, where the price gap gets even more lopsided.